So loud. Hi, fourth graders. Welcome back to Miss Grant's Read Aloud of Harry Potter. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 8. Yesterday we read Chapter 7 that was titled The Sorting Hat, where we learned Harry was sorted into Gryffindor. The chapter ends of them going and eating all the food at the feast and then them just falling asleep. So, let us move on to Chapter 8. The Potion Master. There, look! Where? Next to the tall kid with red hair, wearing the glasses. Did you see his face? Did you see his scar? Whispers followed Harry from the moment he left his dormitory the next day. People lining up outside the classroom stood on tiptoe to get a look at him, or doubled back to pass him in the corridors again, staring. Harry wished they wouldn't, because he was trying to concentrate on his way to class. There was 142 staircases at Hogwarts. Wide, sweeping ones, narrow ones, rickety ones, and some that led somewhere different on Friday. Some with vanishing steps halfway up that you'll remember to jump. Then there was a door that wouldn't open unless you asked politely or tickled them exactly the right place. The doors that weren't really doors at all, but solid walls just pretending. They were also very hard to remember where anything was, because it all seemed to move around a lot. The people in the portraits kept going to visit each other, and Harry was sure the coat of armor could walk. The ghosts didn't help either. It was always a nasty shock when one of them glided suddenly through a door you were trying to open. Nearly Headless Nick was always happy to point new Gryffindors in the right direction. But Peeves, the poltergeist, was worth 2 locked doors and a trick staircase if you met him when you were late for class. He would drop waste paper baskets on your head, pull rugs from underneath your feet, and pelt you with bits of chalk, or sneak up behind you, invisible, and grab your nose and screech, "Gotcha, conk!" Even worse than Peeves, if that was possible, was the caretaker, Argus Filch. Harry and Ron managed to get on the wrong side of him on the very first morning. Filch found them trying to force their way through a door that unluckily turned out to be an entrance to the out-of-bounds corridor on the 3rd floor. He wouldn't believe they were lost. He was sure that they were trying to break into it on purpose, and was threatening to lock them up in the dungeon where they were rescued by Professor Quirrell, who was passing by. Filch owned a cat named Mrs. Norris, a scrawny, dust-colored creature with bulging, lamp-like eyes just like Mr. Filch. She patrolled the corridor alone. Break a rule in front of her, put just one toe out of line, and she'll whisk off for Filch, who'd appear wheezing 2 seconds later. Filch knew the secret passageways of the school better than anyone, except perhaps the Weasley twins, and could pop up as suddenly as any of the ghosts could. The students hated him, and it was the dearest ambition of many to give Mrs. Norris a good kick. And then, once you'd managed to find them, there were the classes themselves. There was a lot more magic, as Harry quickly found out, than waving your wand and saying a few funny words. They had to study the night skies through their telescopes every Wednesday at midnight, and learn the names of different stars and movements of planets. 3 times a week, they went out to the greenhouses behind the castle to study herbology. With a dumpy little witch called Professor Sprout. They learned how to take care of strange plants and fungi, and found out what they were used for. Easily the most boring class was History of Magic, which was the only one taught by a ghost. Professor Binns was very old indeed, and had fallen asleep in front of the staff room fire, and got up the next morning to teach, leaving his body behind him. Binns droned on and on while they scribbled down names and dates, and got the Emmerich of the Evil and the Uric of Oddball mixed up. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was a tiny little wizard who would stand on a pile of books to see over his desk. At the start of their first class, he took roll call, and when he reached Harry's name, he gave an excited squeak and toppled out of sight. Professor McGonagall was again different. Harry had been quite right to think she wasn't a teacher to cross. Strict and clever, she gave them a talking to the moment they sat down in her first class. Excuse me. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will ever learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back, and you will have been warned. Then she changed her desk into a pig and back again. They were all very impressed and couldn't wait to get started. But soon they weren't going to be changing the furniture into animals for a long time. After taking lots of complicated notes, they were each given a match, and they started trying to turn it into a needle. By the end of the lesson, only Hermione Granger had made any difference to her match. Professor McGonagall showed the class how it had gone all silvery and pointy and gave Hermione a rare smile. The class everyone had really been looking forward to was Defense Against the Dark Arts, but Quirrell's lessons turned out to be a bit of a joke. His class smelled strongly of garlic, which everyone said was to ward off vampires he'd met in Romania, and he was afraid they would be coming back to get him one of these days. His turban, he told them, had been given to him by an African prince as a thank you for getting rid of the troublesome zombies, but they weren't sure they believed his story. For one thing, when Seamus Finnegan asked eagerly to hear how Quirrell had fought off the zombies, Quirrell went pink and started talking about the weather. For another, they noticed that it was a funny smell hung around the turban, and the Weasley twins insisted that it was stuffed full of the garlic as well, so that Quirrell was protected wherever he went. Harry was relieved to find out that he wasn't miles behind everyone else. Lots of people had come from Muggle families, and, like him, hadn't had any idea that they were witches and wizards. There was so much to learn that even people like Ron didn't have much of a head start. Friday was the most important day for Harry and Ron. They finally managed their way down the Great Hall for breakfast without getting lost once. "What have we got today?" Harry asked Ron as he poured sugar on his porridge. "Double potions with the Slytherins," said Ron, Snape's head of Slytherin House. "They say he'll always favor them. We'll be able to see if it's true." "Wish McGonagall favored us," said Harry. Professor McGonagall was head of the Gryffindor house, but it hadn't stopped her from giving them a huge pile of homework the day before. Just then the mail arrived. Harry had gotten used to this by now, but it had given him a bit of a shock on the first morning when hundreds of owls had suddenly streamed into the Great Hall during breakfast, circling the tables until they saw their owners, and dropping letters and packages onto their laps. Hedwig, who hadn't brought Harry anything so far. Sometimes she flew in to nibble on his ear and have a bite of toast before going off to sleep in the owlery with the other school owls. This morning, however, she fluttered down between the marmalade and the sugar bowl and dropped a note into Harry's plate. Harry tore it open at once, and it said, in very untidy scrawl, "Dear Harry, I know you get Friday afternoons off, so would you like to come and have a cup of tea with me around 3? I want to hear all about your first week. Send us an answer back with Hedwig. Hagrid." Harry borrowed Ron's quill, scribbled, "Yes, please, see you later," on the back of the note, and sent Hedwig off again. It was lucky that Harry had tea with Hagrid to look forward to, because the potions lesson turned out to be the worst thing that had happened to him so far. At the start of term banquet, Harry had gotten the idea that Professor Snape disliked him. By the end of the first potions lesson, he knew he'd been wrong. Snape didn't dislike Harry. He hated him. Potions lessons took place down one of the dungeons. It was colder here than up in the main castle, and would be quite creepy enough without the pickled animals floating in glass jars all around the walls. Snape, like Flitwick, started class by taking roll call, and like Flitwick, paused when he heard Harry's name. "Ah, yes," he said softly, "Harry Potter, our new celebrity." Draco Malfoy and his friends Crabbe and Goyle snickered behind their hands. Snape finished calling the names and looked up at their class. His eyes were black like Hagrid's, but they had none of Hagrid's warmth. They were cold and empty and made you think of dark tunnels. You are here to learn the subtle science of exact art of potion making, he began. He spoke in barely more than a whisper, but they caught every word. Like Professor McGonagall, Snape had the gift of keeping a class silent without effort. As there is little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of softly shimmering cauldrons with shimmering fumes, the delicate powder of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death. If you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. More silence followed his little speech. Harry and Ron exchanged looks with raised eyebrows. Hermione Granger was on the edge of her seat and looked desperate to start proving that she wasn't a dunderhead. Potter, said Snape suddenly, what would I get if I added powdered root to asphalt, to infusion of wormwood? Powdered root of what? To an infusion of what? Harry glanced at Ron, who looked as stumped as he was. Hermione had shot into the air. I don't know, sir, said Harry. Snape's lip curled into a sneer. Tut-tut, fame clearly isn't everything. He ignored Hermione's hand. Let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? Hermione stretched her hand as high into the air as it would go without leaving her seat. But Harry didn't have the faintest idea of what a bezoar was. He tried not to laugh at Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were shaking their heads with laughter. I don't know, sir. Thought you wouldn't have opened a book before coming, eh, Potter? Harry forced himself to keep looking straight into those cold eyes. He had looked through his books at the Dursleys, but didn't expect Snape to remember anything on 1,000 magical herbs and fungi. Snape was ignoring Hermione's quivering hand. What is the difference, Potter, between a monk shook and a wolfsbane? At this, Hermione stood up, her hand stretching towards the dungeon ceiling. I don't know, said Harry quietly. I think Hermione does, though. Why don't you try her? A few people laughed. Harry caught Seamus's eye, and Seamus winked. Snape, however, was not pleased. Sit down, he snapped at Hermione. For your information, Potter, asphalt and wormwood's making a sleeping potion so powerful it's known as the draught of the living death. And a bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, and it will save you from most poisons. As for monkshook and wolfbanes, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite. Well, why aren't you copying this down? There was a sudden rummaging for quills and parchment. Over the noise, Snape said, and a point will be taken from Gryffindor house for your cheeks, Potter. Things didn't improve for the Gryffindors as potions lessons continued. Snape put all of them into pairs and set them into mixing up simple potions to cure boils. He swept around his long black cloak, watching them weigh dried nettles and crush snake fangs, criticizing almost everyone except Malfoy, who he seemed to like. He was just telling everyone to look at the perfect way Malfoy had stewed his horned slugs when clouds of acid green smoke and a loud hissing filled the dungeon. Neville had somehow managed to melt Seamus's cauldron into a twisted blob, and their potion was seeping across the stone floor, burning holes in people's shoes. Within seconds, the whole class was standing on their stools, while Neville, who had been drenched in the potion when the cauldron collapsed, moaned in pain as angry red boils sprang all over his arms and legs. Idiot boy, snarled Snape, clearing the spilled potion away with one wave of his wand. I suppose you added the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire? Neville whimpered as the boils started to pop all over his nose. Take him up to the hospital wing, Snape spat at Seamus. Then he rounded on Harry and Ron, who had been working next to Neville. You, Potter, why didn't you tell him not to add the quills? Thought he'd make you look good if he got it wrong, did you? That's another point you've lost for Gryffindor." This was so unfair that Harry opened his mouth to argue, but Ron kicked him behind their cauldron. "Don't push it," he muttered. "I've heard Snape can turn very nasty." As they climbed the steps out of the dungeon, an hour later, Harry's mind was racing and his spirits were low. He'd lost 2 points for Gryffindor in his very first week. Why did Snape hate him so much? "Cheer up," said Ron. "Snape's always taking points off Fred and George. Can I come and meet Hagrid with you?" At 5 to 3, they left the castle and made their way across the grounds. Hagrid lived in a small wooden house on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. A crossbow and a pair of galoshes were outside the front door. When Harry knocked, they heard a frantic scrabbling from the inside and several booming barks. Then Hagrid's voice rang out, saying, "Back, Fang, back!" Hagrid's big, hairy face appeared in the crack as he pulled the door open. "Hang on," he said. "Back, Fang." He let them in, struggling to keep hold of the collar on the enormous black boarhound. There was only one room inside. Hams and pheasants were hanging from the ceiling. A copper kettle was boiling open on the fire, and in the corner stood a massive bed with patchwork quilt over it. "Make yourselves at home," said Hagrid, letting go of Fang, who bounded straight at Ron and started licking his ears. Like Hagrid, Fang was clearly not as fierce as he looked. "This is Ron," Harry told Hagrid, who was pouring boiling water into a large teacup and putting rock cakes onto the plate. "Another Weasley, eh?" said Hagrid, glancing at Ron's freckles. "I spent half my life chasing your twin brothers away from the forest." The rock cakes were shapeless lumps with raisins that almost broke their teeth, but Harry and Ron pretended to enjoy them, as they told Hagrid all about their first lessons. Fang rested his head on Harry's knee and drooled all over his robes. Harry and Ron were delighted to hear Hagrid call Filch that old git. As for that cat, Mrs. Norris, I'd like to introduce her to Fang sometime. You know, every time I go up there to school, she follows me everywhere. Can't get rid of her. Filch puts her up to it." Harry told Hagrid about Snape's lesson, and Hagrid, like Ron, told Harry not to worry about it, that Snape liked hardly any of the students. "But he seems to really hate me." "Rubbish," said Hagrid. "Why should he?" Yet Harry couldn't help but think that Hagrid didn't quite meet his eyes when he said that. "How's your brother Charlie?" Hagrid asked Ron. "I liked him a lot. Great with animals." Harry wondered if Hagrid had changed the subject on purpose, while Ron told Hagrid all about Charlie's work with dragons. Harry picked up a piece of paper that was lying on the table underneath the tea cozy. It was a cutting from the Daily Prophet. Gringotts break-in latest. Investigations continue into the break-in at Gringotts on 31 July. Widely believed to be the work of a dark wizard or witch. Gringotts goblins today insisted that nothing had been taken. The vault that was searched had, in fact, been emptied that same day. But we're not telling you that what was in there. So keep your noses out, and you'll know what's good for you," said a Gringotts spokesgoblin after noon. Harry remembered Ron telling him that on the train that someone had tried to rob Gringotts, but Ron hadn't mentioned the date. "Hagrid," said Harry, "that Gringotts break-in happened on my birthday? Might have been happening while we were in there." There was no doubt about it. Hagrid definitely didn't meet Harry's eye at this time. He grunted and offered him another rock cake. Harry read the story again. The vault that was searched had in fact been emptied earlier that same day. Hagrid had emptied Vault 713, and if you could call it emptying, taking out that grubby little package. He had been what the thieves were looking for. As Harry and Ron walked back to the castle for dinner, their pockets weighed down with rock cakes they had been too polite to refuse. Harry thought that none of the lessons he had so far had given him much to think about as the tea with Hagrid. Had Hagrid collected that package just in time? Where was it now? And did Hagrid know something about Snape that didn't want to tell Harry? And that is the end of chapter 8. It was quite a short chapter. I think I only have 2 questions for you today, just because it is kind of a shorter chapter. The first one was, let me make sure, it says in the book that they went to this lesson 3 times a week, and it was with a professor called Professor Sprout. What is the name of that lesson? So, the name of that lesson, so tell me that one. And then, what is the, I'm not sure what his title is, but Mr. Filch, what is his cat's name? All right, 4th graders, I will see you on Monday for Chapter 9. Bye.